Hello everybody, welcome back to the Haunted Library. I hope everybody brought their library cards tonight because I'm charging late fees. Look, it's October 30th, we're going to go back to the countdown. Let's enjoy a few stories. The first story is called This is Maria by Brandon Anigan. Bet you can't say that twice. I couldn't even say it once. My husband and I live in a small, unincorporated town on the outskirts of a bigger city. Although we are almost 50 years old, we are 30 to 40 years younger than any of our neighbors. Most of them have grandchildren who visit regularly and drive them wherever they need to go. Not so for the man usually called Professor. His wife, Elena, died 12 years ago. I only knew her briefly, but she and the Professor were one of those life goals kind of couples. I loved spending time with them. They were both so witty and clearly still deeply in love. Elena's passing hit her husband hard. For the last year, he'd been battling cancer. With no bus service in our rural area and cabs from town being expensive and a long wait, I ended up driving him to doctors. The Professor had been in the U.S. since his 20s, but he still retained a charming foreign accent. My name he pronounced "aw-eh." Usually when he phoned me, he would say, "Good afternoon, on-eh." Sometimes he would call in the wee hours, in pain, able to only gasp, "on-eh." I would drop the phone and run to his house to help him with his meds or take him to the city's emergency room. He did not like to stay away from home, however. He knew the end was near and he wanted to go in his own bed. On October 1st, at almost 4 a.m., my cell phone rang, showing the Professor's number. When I answered, a strange voice asked, "On-eh?" "Yes," I'd answered. "Professor?" "No," the voice giggled. "This is Maria. I'm taking him tonight." Then I woke up. I was sitting up in bed with the phone in my hand. My husband and our dog were sleeping soundly, so the phone hadn't really rung, or had it. I started to call the Professor, but if he was managing to get some sleep, I didn't want to disturb him. So I got up and dressed quietly, and the dog and I slipped out the backyard. I could see the Professor's house from here. No lights were on, and everything was quiet. I wasn't comfortable, though, so I went ahead and dialed. 25 rings, no answer. Damn, I knew then. I went back in and woke up my husband. We walked to the house and knocked. Nothing. We had to phone the sheriffs. They broke in. The Professor had died, seemingly peacefully in bed. Because of our unincorporated location, any of the chores that would fall to the professionals in an urban area are taken up by the neighbors here. So that evening, with a deputy's supervision, the families on our block began to sort through the Professor's papers. We needed the deed to his burial plot and any kind of work or link to distant relations. I looked through a small scrapbook of old photos that was on his nightstand. There was no cousin Marco from the old country or nephew Bob, New York City, 1977. It was mostly pictures of Elena and the Professor, and their never spoken of young daughter Maria, who died in Oaxaca in 1971. Story 2. At My Window. When I was little, it was just my mom and I in this tiny house in a small town. I have a freakishly good memory, so I can clearly remember the layout of my tiny room, which was the laundry room from the previous owners, with just enough room for my crib against one wall and a window high up on the other. Now, I've always hated windows at night. I won't look out them. I keep the curtains shut or run past them. My fear has always been that I'll look out and see a face staring back. After a bad breakup in my early 20s, I moved back home with my mom, and after she observed this behavior, I told her my weird paranoia. She kind of laughed and proceeded to tell me when I was about 2 that I would scream and scream that there was a man in my window. I had nightmares, so she didn't really think much of it until one night she came in to shut me up, and there he was. A fucking man staring in the window. I looked at her like she was nuts. How could I not have known this? Then she continued to tell me that the man was the father of one of my really good friends growing up. He was known for peeping into single women's windows. She also didn't tell me I had a benign heart murmur, and when the doctors discovered it in my early 20s, that scared the shit out of me too. Thanks, Mom. Story 3. 911 Calling by Indiana Joan. This took place when I was about 10 years old. My mom had rather quickly filed for a divorce, but she only had a part-time job and made very little money, so finding a place to stay that was affordable and available immediately was tough. A friend of hers told her that she and her husband had a little mobile home that was currently set and empty, and we could rent it practically for free, till we figured out something else. I immediately didn't like the house. Part of this, I'm sure, was due to my parents' abrupt divorce and having my life turned upside down, but it was just the house itself in general. We lived in a mountain town, and this mobile home was way up a steep mile, long driveway too. Beautiful pine trees surrounded it, but the house itself looked abandoned and just out of place. It had 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, so my brother and I shared a room and my mom took the bedroom with the attached bathroom. It was very 70s style home, with wood paneling and dated fixtures. We've all been in one of those houses. There were also areas that showed strange damage, like holes in the wall that were badly patched up. For whatever reason, I immediately refused to go in the hallway bathroom. I wouldn't even step into it. My mom never really asked me why or questioned it, but let me use her bathroom. Anyway, my mom was gone a lot trying to find whatever work she could, so I would be home a lot after school and on the weekends. Each time I received the 911 call, I was by myself. My mom always told us not to answer the door, but we should always answer the phone in case it was her. So when the phone rang one afternoon, I figured it would be my mom since no one else really had her number yet. There was a woman on the phone who sounded very concerned. "Hello, this is 911, returning your call. We received your call, but we got disconnected," the woman had said. I immediately got a sick feeling. I told her that I did not call 911, and she asked me if there was anyone else in the house who might have called. I said I was home alone, but I started to get really worried that maybe I wasn't. She said she would dispatch police to our address just to make sure everything was okay. At that point, I was terrified to be in this house, so I sat outside and nervously waited for the police, who showed up in about 15 or 20 minutes. The officer asked me if I had called 911, and of course I said no, but they claimed I had called them. The officer just sort of shrugged and said, "This kind of thing sometimes happens. They say that it can't, that the numbers can't get mixed up, but it happens." He did a glance around the outside of the house and left. I tried to convince myself that the officer was right. It was just a mixed up phone call, and hopefully whoever did actually call got the help they needed. Well, about a month later, the same thing happened. I got another call from 911 saying they had received a phone call from my number. I told them again that it must have been a mistake. The woman on the phone scolded me a bit, telling me that 911 wasn't something to play around with and I was preventing people from getting help. She didn't dispatch any police this time. Again, I was really worried someone was in this house, so I cautiously checked and made sure all the doors were still locked. I don't know why, but I always kept the hallway bathroom door closed. Maybe because of that eerie feeling I got from it. As I was checking the house, I just knew someone was in that bathroom. I was terrified. Part of me felt like I needed to open the door to check, maybe to prove myself wrong, but I was too afraid. So I just sat in the living room watching that door. It was so quiet in this house that after a few minutes I swore I started to hear faint little sounds coming from inside, like a kind of shuffling noise. I asked my mom to check the bathroom when she got home, and she quickly looked inside. She made me come and look to see that it was empty, and I was letting my imagination get the better of me. The 911 calls happened 3 more times over the coming months, and only when I was home alone. The 4th time, the dispatcher told me I could face criminal charges for what I was doing, and they would contact my parents. I hung up the phone, sobbing and terrified. I had the feeling like someone was in the house again, but if I called 911, they probably wouldn't even show up. Felt like the girl who cried wolf, only it wasn't me. It was like someone was playing a horrible, twisted joke on me. I sat and watched the bathroom door again, hearing noises like someone dragging their fingers across the door. I decided my mom was right, and I was probably just letting my imagination get away. I decided to try and leave the bathroom door open so I wouldn't get so freaked out by the thought that someone was in there. Then I got the 5th 911 call. This time, though, after I hung up the phone with the dispatcher, the bathroom door slammed shut. I ran all the way down our steep driveway and found a place to wait until my mom pulled into the drive. When she arrived, she was angry with me for leaving the house, but she saw how upset I was. I think maybe she thought I was acting out due to the stress of the divorce. I refused to be alone in this house again, so we worked it out so I would stay later at school or go to a nearby friend's house until she got off work. Not long after this, we got a notice from my mom's friend that we needed to move out of the house because her mom needed a place to stay. I was so grateful to be moving out. I told my mom she needed to tell her friend that something was wrong with this house, but my mom had thought that was a ridiculous way to pay someone's generosity. I moved around a lot the next few years and tried to forget about the house. It wasn't until I was older that I really thought about it. I witnessed an accident and had to call 911, and the fear and paranoia all came flooding back. I decided to do some research, which honestly, I wish I had never done. A few years before we moved in, a woman was killed in that house in some kind of domestic dispute. It was days, though, before she was found, lying dead on the bathroom floor. Story 4. A Real Fixer-Upper by Pickle Juice in My Paper Cut. About 5 years ago, my husband Adam and I decided that it was finally time to start looking to purchase a house. We had always talked about buying an older fixer-upper home because we've had the idea they hold the more charm and character. Plus, we can appreciate a place that has its own quirks, and we love the thought of turning something run down into something beautiful again. With that being said, I grew up in a pretty rural farming town in Indiana that had more than its fair share of run-down houses. The surrounding areas had started to boom a little bit, with farmland being sold off and turned into new factory locations, along with new subdivisions for the people coming to work. I thought it'd be a great place to start in our new house. I figured we'd be a lot closer to civilization than I used to be growing up, but not so much so that we'd be living a stone's throw away from our neighbors too. Adam and I decided to take a drive one summer Sunday afternoon so I could show him some of the back roads in my hometown and to also see what some of the properties we checked out online looked like in person. As we were turning off the main road through town and further into a more secluded country road, we noticed that the very first house on the left was completely abandoned. We pulled into a small patch of the yard where the grass was the shortest and where a gravel driveway used to be, to further investigate. It was painted a deep green color, which made it almost invisible against the tall grass, sticker bushes, and weeds that had grown up around it. There was a massive tree in the front yard whose branches and leaves helped to camouflage this place even further. The house looked as if it were at least 100 years old. It looked like it had sat empty for years. It looked neglected, weather-worn, and in need of major love. In that moment, of course, for us, it was perfect. There was nothing but woods across the street and no neighboring houses in sight. So Adam and I thought it probably wouldn't hurt if we just trespassed a little. I completely justified my reasoning by thinking, well, we're interested in buying the property. We're not here to cause trouble. We're doing someone a favor. We could take this burden of a house off someone's hands. We just need to take a look around first, that's all. Plus, there weren't any no trespassing signs anywhere, so I was perfectly armed with my newfound inflated ignorance and arrogance to assess this property. We walked carefully through the brush towards the left side of the house, where we noticed a well that was still standing, complete with bucket, rope, handle, and the original overhang. Directly across from the well, there was a side entrance into the house through what looked like an added-on mudroom. The screen door to the mudroom was closed. However, there was a wooden door behind it that was half open. This was our not really intrusive because we aren't breaking anything to get in way in. It was probably in the mid-90s outside that day, so when we entered, Adam went first, we were met with this thick, stifling heat. The kind that holds so much humidity that it almost takes your breath away. What we thought was a mudroom was an extended pantry area or canning kitchen. It was tiny with one window and an old rusted sink. A small stove in the wall still held shelves above shelves of canned and spoiled vegetables in jars. It also had the doorway into the main part of the house, and this is where my elation came to an end. Through the doorway was the kitchen. What remained of the cabinets and sink were against the wall on the left, but they were either broken or hanging on for dear life or both. The kitchen connected to a wide-open living area, with one side having walls streaked with black that led up to a half-sunken gray ceiling. There had been a fire at some point. The windows on that wall were filthy, covered in dust or ash that made the room much darker than it should have been in the middle of the day. My heart sank. I knew we wouldn't be able to afford the costly repair of a house fire, but I kept that disappointing thought to myself for the time being. The open living area had not one stitch of furniture, except for one small wooden rocking horse that a child would have. The floor was littered with magazines, as if someone had a giant stack of them and just threw them up in the air to see where they'd land. Curious as to what the former homeowners liked in regards to reading material, I decided to check them out. Almost every single magazine was related to dolls in some way. Porcelain doll collecting, Barbie dolls, making dolls by hand, clothing for dolls. I felt a little creeped out by it, especially under the surveillance of the rocking horse's dead, painted-on stare. But I figured that an old lady must have lived in the house before, and I created a self-medicating idea that her husband probably died and this was the only hobby she had to pass her time. We decided to check out another room that was connected to the half-burned living area. Through the doorway to the left was a weird combination of a molded stand-up shower with handicap handles, and assisted toilet next to it divided down the middle by a wall. On the right was a wall made entirely of built-in bookshelves. The shelves were full of paperback, manila envelopes, books, and even more magazines. It struck us as a pretty weird setup, but thought these people must have really loved to read while sitting on the toilet. My husband and I thought we could find out who the previous homeowners were, since some of the paperwork on top of the stacks seemed to be old bills. If we wanted to look up property records, at least now we would have a name to go on. I grabbed a stack of papers and began to flip through them. When about halfway through, they began to change from old telephone bills to printed out color pictures from the internet of porcelain dolls, wouldn't you know. I put the stack of papers back on the shelf and picked up a small red 5-star notebook. I started from the beginning, casually leafing through and seeing daily entries of medications taken, blood pressure and glucose measurements written in a neat hand. About 20 pages in, the entries started to change entirely. They became crude drawings of twisted faces, done in red ink. The faces had horns or bloody fangs. Then full-on drawings of devils appeared in the pages after. I wanted to believe that a child had picked this up to doodle, but I felt like this was something much different than that. After the drawings, the notebook became someone's personal journal, written in what I assumed was an elderly man's cursive. It told of how he knew he was coming toward the end of his life, and how he remembered being just a young boy when his mother had passed away. He described, in detail, how the wake for his mother was held in the front room of his home, and how during those nights, he crawled on top of his mother's body in her coffin to sleep. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Even though I had been sweating from the thickness in the air, a sudden rush of goosebumps came over me. I immediately showed it to Adam, flipping to the pages of devils and snarled faces, and then read aloud this stranger's memories of his mother's just to see if it was the same the second time around. After I finished, he said, "Well, this just got a whole lot weirder," nodding to what he held in his hands. While I was reading the notebook, he had continued rifling through the mountains of papers. One stacked not only more printed pictures of dolls, but now they contained pictures of real women in torture bondage, ball gags or electrical tape placed over their mouths, jumper cables twisting their nipples, being hogtied with rope. Sometimes there was more than one woman in the picture. It felt as though a brick had been tossed into my stomach. For some, those images wouldn't be disturbing, but in the context of our visit, my panic was starting to grow. I was torn between wanting to find out more and getting the fuck out. Adam reassured me that while it was on the creepy side, it wasn't anything to necessarily lose my shit over, since the woman didn't seem to be suffering or bleeding. The burned-out living area was separated from the rest of the house by a staircase. The staircase had a room directly across from it and a small hallway on the other side that led to the main room at the front of the house. We debated on going up to the second floor, but decided against it since it already felt like we were roasting in an oven and were unsure of the stability of the second story. Going into the room across the staircase, we noticed a few more doll magazines on the floor, but not near the number as in the other rooms. They were scattered plastic doll pieces here and there, random arms and heads. To the left was the original fireplace with a couple tiny vases on the mantel. Smack dab in the middle was a framed picture of an elderly couple, smiling and happy. These certainly weren't the type of people that would have pictures of women bound and gagged hidden away in their bathroom. These people could have been my grandparents, I thought to myself. To the right was a big bay window, and smack dab in the middle was a yellow piece of paper with a faded black printed handwriting on it. It was for anyone on the outside of the house to see, before it became overgrown. Reading it backwards from inside, it said, "If you're here to talk about Jesus, go away." "That's kind of hilarious," Adam said after reading it to himself. "Yeah, it kind of is," I half chuckled, but something in my brain was now starting to nag me even more. Something wasn't computing correctly for me. Thinking back, my mind was putting together that an elderly couple in this town would more than likely be pretty religious, and by the super small chance that they weren't, it would have been gossiped about had someone seen that in the window. It was as if the house had held two different personalities within. I told my husband I just wanted to go into the last room down the hallway and then I would be very ready to leave. Going down the small hallway, it became darker and cooler. It was a relief from the oppressive heat that we had been dealing with since first stepping inside. The shade from the giant tree in the front yard had blocked out a lot of the sunlight, making it about 20 degrees cooler. But we soon realized that this wasn't the only reason this part of the house temperature was more tolerable. Around the corner and to the last room, it took a few seconds for our eyes to adjust to the difference in light, but the change of air was pretty noticeable. It was as if we'd stepped into a cave. The smell was dank and left a dampness on our skin. Once things came into clear focus, that's when we saw it. The main reason our senses had shifted so quickly: the large hole in the floor. At first we thought that perhaps the wooden floor was so weak that it had simply caved in on its own, or that the roof had leaked and caused this exact area of floor to rot away. But upon getting closer, it became obvious this wasn't the case. The hole was about 5 feet across and went straight down into the earth, with about a 2 feet of space between the remaining floor and dirt. This hole was there because it was made to be there. My husband and I looked at each other. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I said aloud to him while pointing, "What the fuck is this? Why is this here?" I panicked, my breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. Nothing was making sense, and yet the thoughts that had been running in the background of my brain were all coming together like a jigsaw puzzle. Then we saw them, the worn and faded social security cards. A few old and molded, over driver's license just thrown around haphazardly, checkbooks and credit cards, as if someone had emptied their purse or wallet in this room and then just disappeared into the hole. I was overcome with terror and dread. I had to get out of this house. My skin felt like static, as if my whole body had been taken over by the sensation of when your foot falls asleep. I had tears forming in my eyes, and my mind just told me to run. Without having to speak, Adam quickly took me by the arm and led us back down the hallway, through the burned-out living room and kitchen, out the side canning room and back out into the light of day. We ran back down the mangled and tangled driveway to the car. Remembering back, I get the eerie feeling that we weren't the only two people in the house that day, alive or dead. On a side note, the house still stands. We never called the police to report us breaking into the house and finding a giant hole in the floor. However, we drove past it about a year later, and the large tree in the front yard had all of its branches removed. All the windows had been boarded shut, and after doing some research, found out that the land it sits on is for sale. The house itself has been condemned.